Okay, so this is how we're going to do this semester. We're going to kind of review briefly the PowerPoints, and this should correspond to what's in the textbook more or less, with some additions if I can add something useful. So the big questions are, can sociological imagination help you better understand the world? Why do social contexts matter? Where did sociology come from, and how is it different than other social sciences? And how can this book help you develop a sociological imagination? Incidentally, these are the questions that will be used for the first test. So as you're going through the reading, as you're listening to lecture notes and some of the videos that I put up, these are the questions that will be reviewed on the test, plus the additional one out of the reading that's a surprise. So question one, how can sociological imagination help you better understand the world? Sociological imagination was a concept that was developed by a guy named C. Wright Mills, who was quite a maverick for his time. Basically, in a nutshell, it's the capacity to think systematically about how many things we experience in personal lives, but to think about them in different ways. So if you think about someone who's 40 years old, who's unemployed, and has been so for the last 3 years, you might automatically jump to conclusions like the person's lazy, that there must be something wrong with them. When in fact, if you look outside the box, you might realize that his company moved out of the country. He was physically disabled from an accident at work. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can account for why things happen. So sociological imagination is a really important concept. Think about all the current political issues going on with police violence. We tend to think in certain pathways, and in fact, maybe we need to think in some different ways to actually solve the problem. Social networks is an important concept in sociology. Think of all the networks that you belong to. They're the ties between people, groups, and organizations. It can include work organizations. If you work at a large chain, that's even a bigger organization. It could include Twitter and Facebook and different interest groups. If maybe you're a stamp collector, who knows what you like to do, but those social networks are important, and that makes the fabric of what humans interact in. The concept of globalization is also important. The world's become very small. I mean, just the fact that I'm talking to you from Arizona is proof that you don't have to be in a classroom to be learning. And that's just one tiny example. Look at how quickly the coronavirus spread around the world from China. So it includes the increased flow of goods, money, ideas, viruses, and people across national borders. Parts of your car, even though they may be an American car manufacturer, are not made in America. One of the things that sociological imagination does is it challenges our stereotypes, which aren't necessarily bad, but they are impulses that human beings are just prone to have. It's an easy way of thinking about things that we see as inevitable or natural. Sometimes sociological imagination provides insights into why we stereotype and why we discriminate. It facilitates more active and effective participation in the world around us. So in other words, the old saying was, instead of just talking the talk, you need to walk the walk. Well, that's kind of what sociological imagination is. Think about things from different perspectives. Sometimes one of the most difficult things for college students and all of us to do is to ask good questions, good hard questions, instead of accepting easily available answers. And how are these questions formed? Well, they're formed in many ways. Here's one question. Why does the richest country in the world have so many people living in poverty? Far more than others, less wealthy countries. So if you look at the United States, we have far more than our allotment would suggest. And it may have something to do with many other factors besides what you might assume. Aram and Roska in 2011 tracked young adults' progress through diverse college and universities and beyond. They want to see how the outcomes came out. It revealed that different college experiences and different postgraduate paths occurred in spite of what they thought might happen. They found slightly more than 1/3 of the students demonstrated no significant improvement on general skills tests, which makes you wonder, is college even worth the time and money? I think it is, but that's a question to ask. So what questions would a sociologist pose to understand the above findings? Well, there's many of them. Here are 4 to consider. How do students' lives before college shape their college experiences in college? Just think of the example of what class your family's from. If you're in the upper class, middle class, or lower class, does that shape what you do in college? Of course, the answer to that is pretty obvious. It does. How do social organizations in college life shape student experiences? If you're a member of a fraternity or sorority, or a political action group in your college, or part of a science club, those things all make a difference. Does the experience of college benefit everyone equally? Some people who are maybe naturally more gifted spend less time studying and more time socializing, whereas students like me in college, I had to spend a lot of time studying. So the obvious answer to that one is no, it doesn't benefit everyone equally. If you're going to community college and working, that affects your ability and amount of time you have to study. And how do college students' paths shaped by the larger labor market await students upon graduation? Another way of looking at this is you're all thinking at some point of a career path. Do you ever concern yourself with, by the time you get out, is that path going to be available to you? So there are all sorts of things to consider. What kinds of jobs are recent college students getting? You might be surprised to find out that the most employable undergraduate education is mathematics. More graduates in mathematics get jobs out of the gate than any other discipline. You might also find that the most common undergraduate degree is psychology, which ironically has fewer jobs than most people think it does. And of course, they are shaped by the labor market, which might be a concern for you in the future as to what path you choose. Emanuel Wallerstein was a famous sociologist who mapped the development of the world's economies. He's the person, for example, that first used the term first and third world countries based on their economic status. Troy Duster looked at the implications of, both politically and economically, of DNA research. Anyone who's taken a DNA test probably saw the long disclosure that was included with the testing and who has access to it. And we'll talk more about that when we get to adoptions. Molach and colleagues looked at many different aspects of popular culture. And Colin Joler-Mack looked at communications between pigeons and humans. If anything, this slide shows you the scope from the macro of Wallerstein to Joler-Mack's interactionist theory about pigeons and humans. Sociology is a huge reach. You might wonder too about things like the exposure to violence. Does that living in a high crime neighborhood increase the stress levels and harm to children? Not only did Sharkey find this to be the case, but there's a famous study that we won't have time to get into, but I highly recommend. In fact, I'll put a link on the Sociology, the Blackboard webpage for the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. First empirical study that actually demonstrated that exposure to adverse childhood experiences causes mental and physical problems that plague people throughout their lifetime. Question 2, does context matter? Well, of course it does. Humans live in many different contexts all at the same time. Your immediate family, your parents' educational level, their income, the neighborhood that you live in, the community that supports you or doesn't support you, all have a bearing on how you turn out, including, of course, your education. What types of organizations are available and you have access to. It may not seem like a big deal to some people, but programs like Big Brothers and Big Sisters in big cities makes a big difference in some children's lives, whereas people living in more idyllic conditions, it isn't that important because they already have a support network. Even the types of employments. Imagine the difference between parents who are highly educated in the time they spend with their children and parents who are middle class or lower class. The type of employment. If you're working 2 jobs, how many hours a week do you have to spend reading with your children? In fact, one research study showed that the number of words that a child is exposed to by the time they get into grade school is nearly doubled based on the class that you're in. Higher class or upper class families have more time to read because they have either one parent at home or they're not working 2 jobs, whereas lower class families are spending more of their time trying to make ends meet. Even the country that you're born in. Americans are so fortunate to live in the largest and wealthiest country in the world. What would it be like to grow up in Uganda or Bangladesh or some other third world country? And of course, the historical time period. Ironically, Steven Pinker's shown that the history of violence in the world, believe it or not, this is the most idyllic time to live in, even though it might seem, based on the media that you're exposed to, that in fact this is a violent time period, but it's the least violent in all of human history. And all of these contexts affect the individual. And of course, families are simply the most important context. Based on racial, ethnic, and religious identities, families teach us the rules of how to be a citizen, either directly or indirectly. In fact, they provide the first social network, from which come many, many social networks. They influence our educational, cognitive capacities, and especially through how we interact with people over a long period of time. Families help later in life. Not only do we bring children into the world, but we help elderly parents leave the world. And of course, communities shape our development as well. Pat Sharkey was the first person to show the groundbreaking connection between violence in a neighborhood and a children's academic performance. She demonstrated how violence can be absorbed by and transmitted through neighborhood contexts. And it highlights how children who are perhaps the most vulnerable to such exposure experience the effects at school as well as at home. So not only is there violence in neighborhoods, but violence within the family. How do organizations and institutions we are part of help form our context? Well, organizations and institutions are very critical. It's one of those social institutions that is extremely important in forming identities. Think about the institution of religion, how that helps a person form their personal identity. Participation in organizations shape personal and public identities available to us. So growing up in a family with a parent who's in the service has a direct impact on how we personally and publicly identify. So what do you think? Can your racial identity change according to the kinds of institutions we are connected to? And this is a timely question to ask given the fact that all this racial tension exists and has existed for centuries, since the founding of the country. And the short answer to that is that yes, it does. The institutions are a part of all this. In fact, you may have heard bandied around the term institutional racism. Think about today being black in America as opposed to 1910 in the South, in the 1940s in Detroit, where I grew up at, in the 1950s, women entering adulthood, what was available to women. Are these things changed today? Well, the short answer is yes. So sociology involves the study of diverse contexts within which individuals, society influences individuals. So think about three concentric rings or overlapping rings: psychology, sociology, and anthropology. So psychology is the study of individuals. Anthropology is the study of human cultures and how we give meaning to the world. And sociology is the study of how social groups influence individuals. Those overlaps are important. The overlap of sociology and psychology is called social psychology. The overlap of sociology and anthropology is called cultural anthropology. And of course, sociology often distinguishes between social interactions and social structure, which we'll talk about in chapters 3 and 4. Question 3 is, where did it come from and how is it different than other sciences? Well, there's many places it came from. The father of modern sociology is considered Auguste Comte, who coined the term sociology. There were other people in the history of science that were important. Commons talked about economics and sociology, as well as Karl Marx. Much later on, and of course Adam Smith was a great economist that really the foundation of modern economies is based on. The takeaway from this is that sociology, like psychology, came out of the foment of the scientific revolution. And of course, some of these people became the foundation of the modern schools of sociology, which we'll talk about. So, for example, Karl Marx was the founder of what's called conflict theory that we'll talk more about later. Emil Durkheim was the founder of what's called functionalism, which looks at how the interactions of institutions within society are there for a purpose and a reason. And of course, people at the University of Chicago were influential in creating the first sociology department in the United States. Some important events in the history of the United States and other parts of the world include industrialization, which is super important. The growth of factories and large-scale production had unintended consequences on human cultures, the development of technologies. Imagine today not having a cell phone. How has it changed your life? Or having a smart home where you give everything voice commands to turn on and off. It's a far cry from building a fire. It's led to immense social changes and a different approach to how we look at society. Another important factor, I mentioned one already besides industrialization, and that's globalization. Another one is urbanization. people moving from rural areas into cities. And the reason they did that was because that's where industry was at. We shifted away from agriculture to manufacturing. Think about the small farm in the United States. Does it even exist anymore? Or is agribusiness the way of the world today? And of course, the problems that come from urbanization are far different than they were when society was much smaller. There's new types of political change and, of course, social movements. How does sociology differ from other social sciences? Well, in some ways, it's because it covers a wider range of topics. You might think that medicine, for example, is a pretty remotely removed from sociology, but in fact, it's not. There's an entire branch of medicine or sociology called medical sociology. Do people in different social groups, for example, have the same or adequate medical care? It explains how the external world shapes behavior of individuals and how social outcomes are broader. So we're changing our lens from the individual, which is psychology, to the lens of groups, which is sociology. We can look at sociology from different levels, from the micro to the middle to the macro level, different units of analysis, making a wider range of connections other than the social sciences, as I mentioned, into medicine. Some of the spin-offs from sociology include the science of criminal justice or criminology, gender studies, which is a huge area, including racial studies. African American studies is a very narrow view of ethnicity and race. Latino studies and Latina, and organizational or management studies, thinking about institutions, which we'll talk about later on. And of course, question 5 is, how can this book help you develop a sociological imagination? To provide background on key areas of research findings for the development of sociological imagination, keep in mind that in modern sociology, the focus is on empirical research, not anecdotal, not observations like Karl Marx made from his ivory tower, but in fact, getting out there and beating the bushes and finding out what the key data is about social processes. It helps us facilitate understanding of how individuals' lives are embedded in social contexts and not always by our own choosing. Develop an appreciation of how personal issues that individuals face can often be understood in larger social problems facing society. And finally, to convey the idea that sociology as a discipline is a project, that it's an ongoing, evolving project.